I never believed in God. Not once. Not even when my mother Dorothea pressed my small hands together above a pew at St. Crispin's Lutheran Church in the winter of 1961. Not even when the choir opened their mouths and the sound poured out like something warm being poured from one vessel into another. I watched those people around me, their eyes closed, their faces tilted slightly upward as if receiving a soft rain, and I felt nothing except a vague embarrassment for them. They seemed to me like children who had never been told the truth about Santa Claus. Gentle, sincere, terribly mistaken. My name is Renly Foss, and I am 70 years old, and I am telling you this because nobody tells you that the most violent transformation of your life will happen when you are already old. When your knees creak getting out of bed. When the years behind you outnumber the years ahead by so enormous a margin that arithmetic becomes a kind of cruelty. Nobody warns you that the earthquake comes late. They let you believe the ground has already settled. I grew up in Presque Isle, Maine, which is a town at the very top of the state, close enough to the Canadian border that in winter the wind carries a different kind of cold. Not the cold of simply low temperatures, but the cold of enormous empty space, the cold of the tundra pressing southward like a slow, gray hand. My father, Bertil Foss, was a potato farmer. His hands were extraordinary things. They looked like the roots of very old trees. He did not speak much, but he moved through the world with a competence so complete that it looked like peace. I loved him the way you love a mountain, not tenderly, but with awe. My mother, Dorothea, was a woman made almost entirely of worry and hymns. She wore her faith the way other women wore perfume, constantly and without thinking, as something that simply emanated from her. She believed with a conviction that I found, even as a small child, both admirable and baffling. Admirable because it was genuine. Baffling because I could not understand how a person so intelligent, and Dorothea Foss was shrewd in the way that women who survive cold places and difficult men become shrewd, could accept something so obviously constructed. By the time I was 14, I had read Darwin. By 17, I had worked through most of Bertrand Russell. By the time I left for the University of Vermont on a partial scholarship in the autumn of 1972, I had assembled my atheism into something I wore like armor. Not aggressive atheism, not the kind that needs to announce itself at family dinners. Just a quiet, internal certainty. The universe was matter in motion. Consciousness was an emergent property of complex biological systems. Death was the cessation of that process. There was no pilot behind the wheel. I studied biology, then secondary education. I became a high school biology teacher in Burlington, Vermont, where I taught for 31 years. I married a man named Calder Yount, an electrician with reading glasses perennially pushed up on his forehead, who shared my disbelief and my love of birding and my habit of putting too much pepper in everything. We had one daughter, Solveig, who grew up to be a geologist in Denver. We were ordinary and we were content, and nothing catastrophic happened to us for a very long time. And I understood this to be luck. Nothing more, nothing less. Just the statistical variation of a cold universe that had produced us by accident and would return us to disorder in due course. Calder died in 2019, pancreatic cancer, which is a disease that moves like a fire through dry grass. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I was alone in the house we had shared for 41 years, and I sat with his absence the way you sit with a very loud noise that has just stopped. Your ears still ringing, your body still braced. I grieved in the way that atheists grieve, which is to say, completely. No mitigation, no softening frame, just the pure, uncut weight of the thing. I moved through the following years like something that had been slightly broken and then glued back together, functional but careful. I started walking every morning, long walks, 4 or 5 miles, along the edge of the Winooski River when the light was new. I listened to podcasts, to audiobooks, to lectures. I filled the silence with information because information had always been the thing I trusted most. It was during one of these walks, in the spring of 2022, that I first listened to a pastor named Obadiah Turrentine. I want to explain how I came to listen to a pastor at all, because it requires a small detour. My daughter Solveig had been sending me links for months, not to religious content, but to historical lectures, to documentaries about ancient civilizations, to archaeological findings from the Near East. She knew I was trying to fill time. She knew I needed to feel like I was still learning. One evening she sent me a lecture that I assumed was academic. The thumbnail showed an older black man at a whiteboard covered in what appeared to be historical timelines. The title mentioned ancient Israel and genetic research. I pressed play, expecting a university professor, and received instead the voice of Obadiah Turrentine. His voice was not what I expected from a pastor. It was quiet, almost conversational. He sounded less like a man speaking to a congregation and more like a man thinking aloud in a room where he didn't know anyone was listening. He was talking about genetics, about mitochondrial DNA, about haplogroups, about what the genomic record says about the population of the ancient Levant. I kept listening because the science was interesting. I kept listening past the science because the man was interesting. He was rigorous in a way I had not expected. He cited studies. He named researchers. He acknowledged counter-arguments before dismantling them carefully, without contempt. I want to be precise about what he was saying, because what he was saying was not simple, and I have no interest in simplifying it now. Obadiah Turrentine was arguing, and had been arguing, apparently, for 2 decades in various churches and lecture halls and internet platforms, that the ancient Hebrews of the Bible, the people of the Old and New Testaments, were not the white-presenting figures of European iconography, but were among the ancestral populations from which modern African-descended people, particularly Black Americans, carry significant genetic and cultural inheritance. He was not saying this as theology alone. He was saying it as history, as archaeogenomics, as a matter of what the physical and genetic record, honestly examined, actually suggests. I listened to that first lecture 3 times. I was not convinced. I want to be honest about that. I was interested, and interest is not conviction, and I have spent enough years in classrooms to know the difference between a compelling presentation and a true one. But I pulled up the studies he had cited. I found them. I read them. I read papers by population geneticists discussing the composition of ancient Levantine populations. I read archaeological literature about the physical appearance of ancient Egyptian and Canaanite populations. I read about the Lemba people of southern Africa whose Y chromosomal evidence was studied extensively in the early 2000s. I read about genetic clustering of Yemenite Jews and Ethiopian Jews, and what these findings imply about the original population's geographic origins and phenotypic distribution. The ground was shifting beneath me, but it was not yet an earthquake. I found more of Turrentine's lectures. In one of them, he spent 40 minutes discussing the word Ethiopians in classical sources, in Herodotus, in Josephus, in Diodorus Siculus, and how the word was used by ancient authors not as a specific national designation, but as a broad descriptor for dark-skinned African peoples. He discussed how Greco-Roman writers described certain ancient Near Eastern peoples using terminology that, applied today, we would recognize as describing Black African phenotypes. He was careful. He held the evidence at arm's length and let it speak without forcing it. He kept returning to the same phrase, "I am not asking you to believe anything. I am asking you to look." I looked. I looked for months. From the spring of 2022 into the summer, into the autumn, into the gray winter that came after. I was still an atheist. I was not reading the Bible. I was reading genetics papers and archaeological reports and the works of scholars like Frank Snowden Jr. and Sheikh Anta Diop, and the responses to those scholars, and the responses to the responses. I was doing what I had always done with any subject that interested me. I was triangulating toward the most honest available position. And the most honest available position was more complex than what I had always assumed. The image of ancient Israelites that I had absorbed without examination, the image that had been painted, literally and figuratively, by European artists for 1,000 years, was not historically defensible. The Levant sits at the intersection of Africa and Asia. Its ancient populations were not Northern European in phenotype. The ancient world did not have the racial categories that modernity imposed on it. When the earliest representations of ancient Israelites appeared in art not made by Europeans, in Egyptian tomb paintings, in Assyrian reliefs, the people depicted did not look like the people in Renaissance frescoes. None of this made me believe in God, but it disturbed my certainty about what I had dismissed. The earthquake did not come from the scholarship. It came from Wilda. Wilda Marchbanks was my neighbor. She was 83 years old, a Black woman who had moved to Vermont from Georgia in 1969 with her late husband, a man named Spurgeon Marchbanks, who had taught philosophy at UVM until his death in 2011. Wilda was small and sharp-eyed and moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that her body was a finite resource to be budgeted carefully. She had a garden that was an act of aggression against the Vermont climate. Things grew there that had no business growing there. Figs, okra, a lemon tree that she brought inside every winter with the seriousness of someone evacuating a child. I had known Wilda for 20 years as a neighbor, which is to say, I knew her superficially and well at the same time. We had shared fences and small conversations and occasional dinners. After Calder died, she had brought food to my door for 3 weeks without being asked. I had never known her faith to be anything except a background fact, the way I knew she had been a high school English teacher, the way I knew she preferred tea to coffee. One evening in November of 2022, I was sitting on her porch drinking tea. I had, without entirely meaning to, begun telling her about the lectures I had been listening to, about Turrentine, about the genetics papers. She listened in the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with her eyes steady on my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know that the Bible says Moses was mistaken for an Egyptian." I said, "I did know that." She said, "You know it says his hand turned leprous as a sign. Some scholars read that to mean it turned white, that in the ancient text, white skin was the abnormality requiring explanation." I said I had read something about that, yes. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Renly, you have been studying the history, but you haven't asked about the presence." I didn't know what she meant. I asked her. She said, "The scholarship can tell you who these people might have been. It can't tell you whether any of it is alive, whether the God in those books is actually there. Those are different questions, and you've only been asking one of them." I sat with that for a while. Then I said, because I am a woman who has always said what she actually thinks, "I don't know how to ask the other question. I've never had the equipment for it." Wilda looked at the garden for a moment. The fig tree was still outside, impossibly in November, the last of its leaves catching the porch light. She said, "You ask it the same way you'd ask anything else. You just say, 'If you're there, show me something.'" I want to tell you what happened next without making it sound like something it wasn't. There was no light. There was no audible voice. There was no single moment that I can point to and say, "There." I did not fall to my knees on Wilda Marchbank's porch in November in Burlington, Vermont. What happened was slower and more like geology than like theater. I began over the following weeks to do what I had never done in 70 years of life. I began to read the Bible not as historical artifact and not as mythology, but as something that might be addressed to me. I read it with Turrentine's historical context layered beneath it. I read it imagining the characters not as the blonde-haired figures of Sunday school illustrations, but as the people the genetics and the archaeology suggested they might have been. Brown people, African-adjacent people, people descended from a place where Africa and Asia breathed against each other. And something changed. I cannot give you the chemistry of it. I cannot tell you which part of my brain processed what. But when I read certain passages, when I read the Psalms particularly, when I read the raw human grief of Lamentations, when I read the extraordinary strangeness of the Gospel of John, something in me that had been closed was open. Not because I had decided to open it, because something had come through it that was warmer than my own thoughts. I am a biology teacher. I know what confirmation bias is. I know what grief does to the pattern-seeking functions of the human mind. I have considered all of these explanations. I have pressed on them hard, and they do not fully account for what has happened in me since that November. They are not sufficient. The truth about the Black people and the Bible, the truth that Obadiah Turrentine spent 20 years trying to articulate, the truth that sits underneath the scholarship like a stone foundation, is not simply a historical correction, though it is that. It is not simply a reclamation of stolen identity, though it is that too. It is something that, once you see it, recontextualizes the entire story. It changes who is speaking and who is being spoken to. It means the long history of suffering, of displacement, of captivity described in those texts belongs most literally to a people whose descendants are still here, still displaced, still bearing a weight that the rest of us have not adequately acknowledged. I was a white woman in Maine who learned the Bible as the heritage of European Christianity. And what I understand now is that I received it secondhand, that it passed through a translation not just of language, but of race and politics and centuries of violence. That the original story, told by its original people in their original context, looks different from what I was given. It is not less mine for that, but it is more theirs. Wilda Marchbanks died in March of 2024 at 85 years old in the house where she had grown her impossible fig tree. I was with her in the last days. I sat beside her and I held her hand, which was small and warm, and I talked to her about the fig tree, which we had moved inside and which had, against all reasonable expectation, produced 3 actual figs that winter. She was barely conscious, but she smiled at that. I believed by that point that she was going somewhere. I believed it the way I believe in the Coriolis effect, not because I've watched it with my own eyes, but because the evidence converges and the explanation holds, and the things that don't fit any other framework fit this one. I am 70 years old, and I am not who I was. I am not entirely sure what I am now, except that I am less certain than I used to be about the things I was most certain of, and more certain than I used to be about the things I had never allowed myself to consider. The universe still ends in entropy. I still believe that. But I believe now that entropy is not the final word. I believe there is a word behind it. Dorothea Foss died in 1998. She never knew I would come to this. I find myself sometimes on my morning walks along the Winooski talking to her, telling her I am sorry it took so long, telling her the choir was right and I was the one who didn't know what I was hearing. The cold comes up off the river in spring, and I walk through it and I think, all those years I spent being certain. All those years I spent collecting the right answers. And here is the thing that humbles me most. It was not an argument that moved me. It was a scholarship that opened a door, and an old woman on a porch, and the willingness, finally, at 69 years old, with my husband gone and my life behind me and nothing left to prove, to ask a question I had refused to ask for 50 years. If you're there, show me something. Something was shown. If this reached something in you, like, subscribe, and let's keep finding truth together.